So when I posted my last video about how China and the Soviets would have lost World War II if it wasn't for the United States, I knew for a fact that the pro-Chinese and pro-Russian crowds were going to come flying out of their mom's basements or their bot farm cubicles to angrily try to correct the record here. So I'm going to tell you a little story about the Red Army first, and then I'll get to China in the next video. But by 1942, the Red Army's greatest asset was manpower. We all know that, but its weakest link was logistics. Without the 400,000 US trucks, Studebakers, jeeps, motorcycles, etc., the Red Army would have remained largely horse-drawn, with wagons, like the 1800s. Supply lines would have stretched thin and broken in the mud and snow. Instead of fast mechanized offensives, the Soviet armies would have crawled forward at a snail's pace, which would have exhausted the infantry and their draft animals. Winter offensives, like the kind we saw that historically smashed German lines at Stalingrad and Kursk, would have stalled because ammunition and food couldn't reach the front in time. A Red Army without Lend-Lease would have been an army of men marching through mud without boots on, dragging 1930s-era artillery by hand, half-starved, with their clothes rotting off their backs from weeks of wet and cold weather. On top of that, the Soviet Union lost much of its farmland in the German invasion. Lend-Lease shipped nearly 5 million tons of food, including meat, flour, sugar, fats. All of that kept Soviet soldiers alive. They literally would have starved to death if it wasn't for the United States, let alone conducted any kind of movements on the front line. Without the United States, their rations would have been cut to starvation levels. Picture Soviet riflemen gnawing on the crusts of black bread, hollow-eyed, while German soldiers, though strained themselves, still had supply convoys, mechanized ones at that. Malnutrition would have weakened the Red Army's endurance, leading to more desertion, disease, and death from exposure. That all means you lose the war. But that's not all. American steel and aluminum, plus 14,000 aircraft and 12,000 armored vehicles, gave the Soviets the material to contest German panzers and the Luftwaffe. Without that, Soviet factories, which were already evacuated east of the Urals, would have strained to even produce a few T-34s and Yak fighters in any meaningful numbers. But what really crippled the Red Army was their shortages of fuel and specialized metals. They couldn't even produce the items to fight the war without that. All of their tank brigades were getting older, with fewer and fewer tanks that were more prone to breakdown. The Soviet Air Force was stretched thin and would have been shredded by the Luftwaffe without thousands of US engines, parts, and radar equipment. Imagine Kursk without the mass Soviet tanks in reserve. That's what won them the battle. Instead of the largest tank battle in history, the German Tiger tanks and Panzer divisions would have rolled through under-equipped rifle divisions, crushing them piecemeal. They wouldn't even really have to shoot anything, they just would have ran them over. That's the reality of how Kursk would have played out. The Soviets relied on US imports for almost half their explosives, aviation fuel additives, and communications gear. No Lend-Lease means fewer radios, so attacks would have been coordinated by flag or by runner, both deadly slow on a battlefield measured in seconds. Soviet artillery barrages, which has since World War II become the hammer of their offensive doctrine, would have sputtered with ammunition shortages. Most of the ammo that contributed to the rolling barrages that eventually broke German morale came from the US factories. Without the US, Russian factories would have provided 1/10 of what was available, and that would have given them scattered, ragged fire, leaving the Wehrmacht positions completely intact. And yes, the Red Army suffered 8 to 10 million military deaths. But without US supplies, their food, their trucks, their fuel, their weapons, these numbers would have easily doubled. Soviet soldiers would have been thrown again and again into frontal assaults with little artillery prep, no air cover, dwindling armor, maybe not even having boots and rifles. Whole divisions would have starved or frozen to death for a lack of winter clothing that was shipped from the United States. Mass graves outside of Stalingrad and Kursk would be deeper and filled not only with the fallen, but the starved and the frostbitten. So without Lend-Lease, the Soviet Union might still have survived in some way. Yes, its geography is vast, its manpower is humongous at the time, but the cost would have been enormously catastrophic and they likely would not have recovered. German armies might have held Stalingrad, cut off the Caucasus oil fields, and bled the Soviets into a stalemate, which means that the Soviet Union's major economic production would have been owned by the Germans. At best, the USSR would have emerged as a ruined, half-occupied land, unable to push into Eastern Europe. At worst, Berlin might never have fallen to the Red Army, and the war in Europe could have dragged into the late 1940s, forcing the US and Britain to invade German-occupied Soviet territory nearly alone. So, in short, without US Lend Lease, the Red Army would have been a gaunt, starving mass of infantry slogging through mud and snow, armed with rifles but lacking ammunition, mobility, tanks, air cover, boots, food, all the things that you absolutely need. And so Soviet victories would have been slower, if non existent, bloodier for sure, with corpses stacked much higher. The Germans might never have been pushed back from the Volga at all. So I don't want to hear it anymore about how the Soviet Union was the dominant power in World War II and the United States just provided a couple of things. That is nonsense, and you are lying on behalf of the Kremlin.